Hello everybody and welcome to our first lecture of the semester, and today we're going to be going over Pre-Columbian America. However, before we do go ahead and get started with this lecture topic, I did want to kind of lay down some ground rules on what lectures are going to look like and how you should utilize them for the course moving forward. Now anyways, with lectures, they're going to be relatively short. I'm going to try to keep each video about 20 to 30 minutes long. Sometimes it'll go a little more, sometimes it'll be a little less, just depending on the material that we're going to have to cover. But anyways, within these videos, I'm going to cover the basic information that you will need to know about today, say Pre-Columbian America, or the topics that we'll be going into in the coming weeks. I'll give you the definitions, I'll give you a brief outline of who, say, the Paleo-Indians were, and go into a little bit of depth about that. Now, with that said, there are also readings as well as a textbook that you should be reading alongside this that will go with each topic. But anyways, make sure that you do watch and review this video before you move forward, whether it's with a quiz or whether it's with an exam. But anyways, with the ground rules out of the way, let's go ahead and get started today with our first lecture of the semester. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we will be going into Pre-Columbian America. Now, the tale of American history, typically we like to start it with either 1492 or 1776. However, the reality is American history begins long before those dates that I just mentioned. And today we're going to be focusing on American history prior to the year 1492. Now, why is that year 1492 so important to us? Well, as we'll see within the next lecture video, that is when Christopher Columbus first comes over and rediscovers the American continents and maintains contact for the next several centuries that leads us up to this present day. But anyways, we're going to be looking at what America today looked like before 1492. What did those societies look like? Because as we'll see, they lived in complete isolation. Now, to understand the tale of American history, or I should say to understand the tale of Pre-Columbian America before the arrival of Columbus, we have to turn the clock back tens of thousands of years, roughly about 15 to 12,000 years ago, to when we first start to see the first indigenous people begin to inhabit what we now recognize as the American continent. Now, the American continents, they will first be inhabited by what historians and archaeologists have coined the Paleo-Indians, or the ancient Indians, who were the first arrivals of migrant peoples who mainly came over from Asia, but also from other parts of the world down into the American continents. Now, as mentioned before, the Paleo-Indians, they arrived roughly about 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, or what I'm going to put up here on the board, around 15,000 BCE, which for those of you that don't know what BCE stands for, it means before Common Era, to roughly about 12,000 BCE, which hopefully I don't cut off my face here in the video. But anyways, this is when we first see the arrival of these ancient Indians. Now, many of them, they will arrive by several means. Now, the most prominent theory that archaeologists subscribe by that has been popular for roughly the past 100 years to try to explain why these first settlers arrived over in the American continents is that of the Beringia land bridge. Now, this is the only theory that you're going to have to write down, but I'm going to go ahead and write it up on the board, Beringia. Now, the Beringia land bridge, it is going to be the area between what is now modern-day Siberia, which is out in eastern Russia or eastern Asia, and that of Alaska. About roughly this time period that I just mentioned a moment ago, we'll see that the world is going to undergo its last ice age. And around 12,000 BCE or so, we'll see that that ice age will come to an end. Now, during that ice age, we'll see that much of the land within the region of Beringia, or between where we see Alaska and Siberia today, was actually exposed land. It created this land bridge to where tens of thousands of inhabitants were able to cross over as they were following herds over to the American continent. Now, initially, as they're arriving across Beringia, they're not going to go down into the Americas immediately. It will take them some time. We'll actually see that it will be roughly a few thousand years before they will actually push deeper, mainly because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the world was undergoing its last ice age. Much of what we recognize today as Canada was this ice sheet that was impassable for these groups to ultimately come down into the American continent. But nonetheless, around 12,000 BCE, we will see that the world will begin to warm. And once the world begins to warm, Beringia, or that Beringia land bridge, it's going to begin to go underwater. And we'll eventually see that there will be roughly about 50 miles of ocean that will separate Asia and the American continents. And we'll see that there will be thousands of individuals who will be trapped over in modern-day Alaska. However, as that sea bridge is beginning to disappear, we're also going to see that that ice cap that was over Canada is going to begin to melt. Now, much of that water that will be generated from those melting ice that melting ice sheet within Canada is going to flow into many of North America's rivers. But it's also going to expose much of that land, make it passable to where those individuals could then move further south and begin to populate the rest of the Americas, which they will do so over the course of the next few thousand years. Now, as they arrive in the Americas, they will mainly be hunter-gatherers. They're not going to develop any sort of towns or cities because they have yet to develop horticulture. That won't come until around the year 8 to 7,000 BC, which I'll get to here in a second. But anyways, they'll come to populate much of North and South America as they begin to chase the various hunting or the various animal groups that will come to populate much of the American continents. Now, there are other theories, and I wanted to address one other theory. There is also believed that Native Americans have arrived in the Americas prior to these dates that I've listed up here on the board. And there's quite a bit amount of credibility to this theory that they arrived 20, even 30,000 years ago into the American continents. And much of this we find through archaeological evidence that comes mainly from South America, but also parts of North America as well. However, the predominant theory that we're going to have to really remember is going to be that of the Beringia land bridge. But anyways, as mentioned, over the course of the next few thousand years following 12,000 BCE, we'll start to see that these groups will begin to populate all over the North and South American continents. Now, as they arrive, they will be hunter-gatherers. They're not going to be focused on producing agriculture, but that's going to change once we get around to the year 7,000 BC, which is when we're going to see the development of agriculture within the as I start writing CE, as we start to see the arrival of agriculture within the American continents. Now, around 7,000 BCE, when we see the agricultural revolution begin to appear within the American continents, it's not something that's going to occur overnight. We're going to start to see that some tribes are going to begin to discover that if you are to plant a crop, say, as corn, beans, and squash, which are indigenous to the Americas, when you begin to plant them in one area, you could actually reproduce that over time. And it will take several generations for this to take hold before we start to see the development of cities, but we start to see that that phenomenon develops around 7,000 BC. Now, one thing I want to stress, with this agricultural revolution occurring around this point in the American continents, it's occurring roughly about the same time as we see it develop over in Europe or over in Africa as well as Asia. And why is that important to us is because in complete isolation, these first Americans were able to develop their agricultural practices in their own horticulture, which is another word for agriculture, in complete isolation without knowing of what techniques were being discovered back over in what will become later known as the Old World, or as I mentioned before, Europe, Africa, and Asia. But anyways, even with the introduction of horticulture by 7,000 BC, it's going to be years before we start to see the development of sophisticated civilizations. Now, there are tons of civilizations that will pop up across the American continents, but we're not going to talk about every single one of those civilizations. We're just going to be focusing on the important ones for us to American history as well as to European exploration a little bit later on. Now, the first civilization that we're going to talk about is going to be that of the Mayan civilization. Now, the Mayan civilization, it will pop up within what we would recognize today as central Mexico as well as the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, the Mayan civilization, it has its origins roughly around 1000 BCE, or I should say 1500 BCE, when we start to see the emergence of horticulture within central Mexico as well as the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, the Mayan peoples themselves, their civilization is not going to flourish until much later on. We'll actually see that they'll be preceded by several civilizations, including the Olmec civilization, which you can read all about within your textbook as well. But anyways, the Mayans themselves, they will come to dominate central Mexico roughly around the year 3000 AD, or 3000, I'll actually write it up for simplicity on the board, 3000 CE, or 3000 Common Era. So this is after the year 0. They will begin to emerge within central Mexico as well as the Yucatan Peninsula, and they will become a powerhouse within this region over the course of the next roughly 600 years, to where they will develop a sophisticated empire, an elaborate trading system, an elaborate religious system, and with it establish many traditions that we'll see passed down, especially later on, to ancestors of their civilization, that of the Aztecs, who we'll get to here in a little bit. However, the Mayans themselves, as they develop also a written language, I might add on to that, their empire isn't going to last forever, because we'll eventually see that they will begin to decline around roughly the year 900 CE. Now, the reason for their decline is for several reasons. Now, I know in popular media, especially from the recent 2012 fiasco, if maybe some of you have seen that movie or heard of the Mayan calendars, but anyways, with the Mayan civilization, unlike what was being told at that time, we have a pretty good idea of why they disappeared. Now, around this time, we'll see that civil strife, famine, as well as overpopulation and environmental disaster are going to be rampant within the Mayan Empire. Now, as the Mayan Empire begins to expand, as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll see they will eventually see environmental disaster. Think about it this way. When you have a much larger population, you're going to need more food to provide for that population. However, as they begin to take more and more land, I should say that growing population, as they begin to take more and more land, you're going to have less land to produce that horticulture, or to produce that agriculture to feed them. And when you have less land for agriculture, you have less agricultural products, and over time you'll have less food. This will create that famine phenomenon that I talked about just a moment ago, where we'll see thousands of people are going to die over the course of several decades because of the lack of horticulture and the lack of agricultural products. Eventually, by around the year 900 CE, with this widespread famine, this is going to also lead to civil strife. Because as people are beginning to starve, they're going to blame those who are in power and begin to revolt against them. A civil war is going to erupt, and then we'll see outside invaders outside of the Mayan Empire are going to come in and disperse the empire. That's pretty much what will happen to the Mayans in a nutshell. However, their civilization won't disappear by the time we get to 900 CE, because we'll see that it will continue to live on, especially in places in Guatemala as well as the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, where the Mayan gets their names will be from the capital of Mayapayan, which will eventually collapse come 1451 for very much the similar reasons that I mentioned just a moment ago. But anyways, they're going to lay the foundations for future empires to emerge within that area as well. And we'll talk about how the Aztecs here in a minute are going to succeed them. But anyways, before we talk about the rise of the Aztecs in 1325, I want to turn our attention very quickly to another group that's important for our tale of American history that's going to emerge in South America, that of the Inca tribes and eventually the Inca Empire that we see emerge around 1200 AD just south of or I shouldn't say just south, within the Andes Mountains as well as in the region of modern Chile today. Now, the Incans themselves, I'm not going to go into too much detail about them because we're really just talking about them, especially in their roles with Spanish exploration a little bit later on. Now, the Incans themselves, they will start to emerge around the year 12,000 AD as we start to see leaders of their tribe look to go on wars of expansion to expand across this mountainous region and the Andes Mountains in South America. Now, by the time of the arrivals of the Spanish, we'll see that the Incans will construct one of the largest empires in the world at that point. That will stretch over several different environments, including deserts, mountains, rivers, lakes, coastal regions, and so on and so forth. Now, alongside this, despite the fact that Europeans are going to promote this myth that these Native Americans, not just the Inca, but all these tribes that we're talking about, where they are going to promote this myth that the Incans were savages, that they were not up to par with the technological advances that we see develop over in Europe, the Incans will very much be ahead of their time. We'll see that they will construct a very elaborate road system, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and several other institutions that will rival some of the things that we see the Europeans have whenever they do arrive. And we'll also see that the Aztecs very similarly are going to construct institutions that will come to rival that of the Europeans. Now, the Incans themselves, their empire will be on the rise until roughly about the mid-1400s, and by the time of the arrival of the Spanish, we're going to see that their empire was on the decline as they were beginning to experience civil war. However, as we'll talk about once we get to the period of Spanish exploration, we'll see that the Spanish would prove to be the final nail in the coffin for the Incan Empire. But anyways, moving on from the Incans, let's turn our attention back north up to that group that we're all fascinated with, that of the Aztecs. the rise of the Aztec Empire. Now, the Aztec Empire themselves, or I should say the Aztec, are also known as the Mexica people. They're going to really emerge as a powerhouse around the year 1325 when they established their capital city at a place called Tenochtitlan. Now, just in a nutshell, Tenochtitlan itself is roughly where you see modern-day Mexico City and the Valley of Mexico along Lake Texcoco. Now, the Aztecs, their capital city is not going to be a traditional city of what we'd see, say, over in Europe, Asia, or other parts of the world. But rather, it's quite literally going to be a city upon a lake. Now, in the year 1325, we'll see that the Aztecs will be in a war with a neighboring tribe on the shores of Lake Texcoco. Now, after this, or as this war was being conducted, we'll eventually see that the Aztecs will be forced onto a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And eventually they will construct a city that will come to house hundreds of thousands of people by the time we get to the 1400s. Now, during the course of the 1300s, we'll see that the Aztecs themselves are slowly going to build up their capital city at Tenochtitlan. We'll start to see that they would begin to establish pyramids on this island. We'll also see that they would continue their religious practices, which included human sacrifice, which will become characteristic of the Aztecs a little bit later on. And we'll also see that they will begin to build many outlying towns on that city, or on the shores of Lake Texcoco by the end of the 1300s. Now, to feed their society on a small island, we'll also see that they will begin to employ what are known as chinapas, which are basically these floating islands that they will construct to develop their horticulture, things like corn, beans, and squash, and so on and so forth. And by the time we get to the beginning of the 1400s, the Aztecs are going to be flourishing, and they were prepared to rapidly expand, very similar to what we'd seen with the Incas during the same time in South America. Now, by the beginning of the 1400s, the Aztecs likewise are going to go on a series of wars of expansion, to where they will expand out from their tiny island in Lake Texcoco, begin to not only conquer much of the coastline of Lake Texcoco, but expand out to places in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Valley of Mexico, central Mexico, as far north as northern Mexico, and even into Central America, into places like Guatemala. Very similar to the Mayans of what we talked about before, they will develop a very elaborate linguistic system. They're going to have their own written language. They're going to have very elaborate religious practices, which will include human sacrifice. And on that note of human sacrifice, I do want to point out those who will be offered up to the gods, they're not necessarily going to be offered because they just didn't like the person. Mainly, we'll see that these human sacrifices, it will play an important role, especially in regards to the religious beliefs that if they did not offer up what we would call blood today, or in the form of a human life, the gods would grow angry and we'd see the apocalypse develop. But anyways, they would practice things like human sacrifice, and we'll also see that they would develop a very elaborate trading system that would expand not just throughout their realms, but even further northward into places like North America, and even as far as to the Incan Empire. Now, the Aztecs themselves, they would be at the height of their power by the middle of the 1400s, and very similar to the Incas, they will begin to decline by the time we see the arrival of the Spanish. And so no surprise that the Spanish likewise would prove to be the final nail in the coffin for this empire also. Now, we see these two major empires have emerged on the American continents by the time of the arrival of the Spanish in 1492. But for the sake of this class, since we're focusing on American history, I should say U.S. history, we now have to turn our attention to the North American civilizations that were beginning to flourish. Perhaps, is there a major empire that was beginning to emerge in North America? Or do we see extremely diverse groups that develop within the North American continent? Now, unlike Central and South America, which let me go ahead as I get a little ahead of myself, in both Central and South America, we saw the construction of these elaborate empires. However, in North America, you're not going to see the establishment of an elaborate empire. Now, by the time of the arrival of Christopher Columbus, North America itself, it will be heavily populated, but it will be extremely diverse. We'll see that across the North American continent, there are hundreds of different societal groups with hundreds of various tribes included within those societal groups that come to dominate the North American landscape. And each one of these groups are going to be impacted by the various geographical environments that they will face within their respective regions of North America. Now, just going through very shortly through the North American civilizations, we'll see that there will be unique groups that form in the American Southwest, groups like the Pueblo Indians, who will be this non-nomadic peoples who will actually develop sophisticated horticulture in the middle of nowhere. However, they really only emerge around the year 1000 CE, and they won't be in existence long enough to establish sophisticated empire like we see the Aztecs or the Mayans. Not to mention, being in the middle of the desert, I think it's probably a little difficult over time to continue to support a growing population, especially with your agriculture. It'll prove to be very difficult. Moving up to the American Northwest, we'll see there would be tribes that would be confronted with the coastal regions of that area. And we'll see that they would be a semi-nomadic peoples living part of the year on the coast and part of the year inland. You also have the Great Plain tribes who will live on the American Great Plains. And the Great Plains is not a very good region to where you could establish a large empire, because as the Spanish would write later on, and as we'll see with Spanish exploration, it was basically this vast desert. Even though it was grassland, it was like this vast desert to where you couldn't grow a whole lot of crops, in their opinion. Moving further east, we will come to a group that potentially could have built a grand empire on the North American continent, because at the source of each one of the empires we've discussed so far, you need trade. And at the center of the group of known as the Mississippian tribes, trade will be their cornerstone. We'll actually see that they will develop a very sophisticated trading system that will extend all the way north and south along the Mississippi River, and it will also take advantage of rivers that bleed out of the Mississippi River. Rivers, and it's important for us to recognize, before the invention of things like railways, cars, and so on and so forth, they were viewed as the natural highways that connected not only nations, but connected whole continents. And we'll see that they would take advantage of this trade. They would begin to develop a non-nomadic society, to where they were based off of agriculture, producing those crops of corn, beans, and squash that were indigenous to America. We'll even see that they would begin to construct large towns. Most notably would be that of Cahokia, which is established roughly about where we see modern-day St. Louis. And we'll see that there would be 12,000 individuals who would come to populate Cahokia at its height by the 1200s. However, very similar to what we had seen within the Mayan Empire, civil strife, famine, as well as overpopulation will be a major problem for Cahokia, especially by the time we get to the 1300s. And by 1350, just roughly about 150 years before we see the arrival of Columbus, that city will collapse as a result of those same issues. Now, moving further east, we'll also see there would be other tribes that would be very diverse in their languages as well as their societal practices. And this is the last group that we're going to talk about within this video, which will be the Eastern Woodlands peoples. Now, these Eastern Woodlands peoples, they will come to dominate the East Coast. And they're divided up into three subgroups of what we will call the Algonquin-speaking peoples, who will live in the regions of New England, as well as the northeastern coast of what we'd see today as Canada. We also have the Iroquois tribes, which will come to dominate the Great Lakes as well as upstate New York. And then lastly, we have the Muskogean peoples, who will come to dominate pretty much everything south of North Carolina all the way down to Florida. These will be the first peoples that will encounter the English settlers at Jamestown, at Plymouth, and at the other colonies that we'll talk about here in just in a few lectures. But anyways, their societies, they will look vastly different from the Europeans. And we'll see that when the Europeans arrive, with the differences in their societal groups, it would lead to a major clash. We'll talk about that one in a future lecture. But anyways, for now, go ahead and write down your notes. Make sure that you read through the required readings for this section as well as through the textbook. But anyways, I'll see you all next time when we talk about Spanish exploration.